The heavy barrel of a suppressed Glock pressed against Jin-ho's temple, the cold steel a sharp contrast to the sweat stinging his eyes. He didn't blink. He couldn't. Across the marble foyer of the most secure penthouse in Seoul, an 80-year-old woman stood clutching a mop bucket, her eyes wide as moons. Mrs. Cho's knuckles were white against the plastic handle, her small frame trembling so violently the water sloshed onto her orthopedic shoes. The man holding the gun, a rival enforcer named Gwang, leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale cigarettes and cheap menthol. "The great Dragon of Busan," Gwang hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Undone by a woman who scrubs toilets for $10 an hour." Jin-ho looked past the barrel, his gaze locking onto Mrs. Cho. He didn't plead for his life. He didn't reach for the knife hidden in his silk sleeve. Instead, his voice came out steady, a low rasp that filled the cavernous room. "Put the mop down, Mrs. Cho. Walk toward the service elevator. Don't look back." The world didn't know how a man who controlled the flow of every illicit shipment from Incheon to Jeju ended up at the mercy of a mid-level thug because of a cleaning schedule. This wasn't supposed to be the end of the legend. This was supposed to be a Tuesday. But 3 decades of secrets were currently vibrating in the pocket of an elderly woman who hadn't even finished the West Wing. This is the story of how the most feared man in the Korean underworld broke every rule of survival for the only person who still called him by his birth name. It is a story of a debt that couldn't be paid in blood, only in the truth that lay hidden behind a door that should have stayed locked. Jin-ho's fingers twitched, tracing the edge of the mahogany console. He had built an empire on the philosophy that every human being was a variable to be exploited or eliminated. Tenderness was a luxury for the dead. Yet 2 hours ago he had stood at the heavy oak doors of his inner sanctum, watching Mrs. Cho struggle with a heavy floor polisher. He hadn't called security. He hadn't barked an order. He had stepped forward, the silk of his $3,000 suit catching the light, and gripped the brass handle. He opened the door for her. He had offered a small, stiff nod, a gesture he hadn't afforded a prime minister in a decade. That single second of humanity had created the crack Gwang needed to slip through the perimeter. "You're a legend for being a ghost, Jin-ho," Gwang sneered, the gun barrel grinding into skin. "But ghosts don't open doors for the help. Ghosts don't have favorites. Why this one? Why today?" Jin-ho's jaw tightened. He watched Mrs. Cho. She wasn't moving. She was staring at a photograph that had spilled out of Gwang's pocket during the struggle. A grainy black and white shot of a charcoal-faced boy standing in front of a burnt-out noodle shop. The first complication had arrived long before the gun. It arrived when Mrs. Cho reached into her apron and pulled out a small, crumpled rice cake wrapped in wax paper. She had set it on the edge of the mahogany desk while Jin-ho was reviewing kill orders. "You look thin, Sang-woo," she had whispered. Jin-ho hadn't corrected her. He hadn't told her that Sang-woo died in an alleyway 20 years ago, replaced by a monster. He had simply eaten the cake. Now that wax paper was the only thing between him and a shallow grave. Gwang's eyes darted to the photograph. He chuckled, a wet, jagged sound. "Is that it? A childhood memory? You let me into the vault for a memory?" He shifted his weight, preparing to fire. Jin-ho saw the muscle in Gwang's forearm bunch. He knew the mechanics of death better than anyone in the city. He had 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds he didn't think about his accounts or his territory. He thought about the smell of the noodle shop before the fire. "Gwang," Jin-ho said, his voice dropping an octave. "Look at the mop bucket." Gwang frowned, his eyes flickering downward for a fraction of a second. It was all the window Jin-ho needed. He spun, his hand catching the slide of the Glock, redirecting the muzzle as the suppressed shot coughed into the drywall. He drove his elbow into Gwang's throat, the sound of cartilage snapping like dry twigs. Gwang fell, clutching his neck, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Jin-ho didn't finish him. Not yet. He stood over the dying man, his suit jacket ruined by plaster dust. He turned to Mrs. Cho, who was still frozen. He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing on the marble. He reached out, not for his gun but for the mop handle. He took it from her shaking hands. "The service elevator, Mrs. Cho," he repeated. "Now." "Sang-woo," she whimpered, her fingers clutching his sleeve. "The photo, the shop." "The shop is gone," he said, his voice like cracking ice. "And if you stay here you'll be gone too." He shoved her toward the hallway just as the heavy thud of combat boots hit the stairs outside. The rest of Gwang's team had arrived. Jin-ho was alone, trapped in a glass cage with a dying man and a woman who knew his real name. He picked up Gwang's dropped weapon and checked the magazine. If you believe that the man who saved a stranger's dignity is worth more than the king who built a throne of bones, hit the like button so this story finds its way to those who still believe in quiet heroes. The hallway erupted in a hail of glass. Jin-ho dived behind the kitchen island, the granite chipping under the impact of high-velocity rounds. He counted 4 shooters. They were moving in a pincer formation, professional and silent. He looked at the service elevator. The light was still red. She was still in the building. He didn't have enough ammunition to win a prolonged firefight. He had his wits and a floor polisher he had seen Mrs. Cho using earlier. He reached out, grabbing a bottle of industrial degreaser from under the sink. He sprayed it across the polished marble entryway, a transparent lake of slick chemicals. As the first 2 shooters rounded the corner, their boots hit the liquid. They went down hard, their tactical movements turning into a frantic scramble for balance. Jin-ho didn't hesitate. He rose and fired 2 precise shots. The men stopped moving. He didn't feel a sting of regret. He felt a cold, mechanical focus. But as he turned to face the remaining 2, a sharp heat bloomed in his side. He looked down. A crimson stain was spreading across his white shirt, blossoming like a dark flower. He stumbled, his shoulder hitting the wall. Jin-ho. Gwang was on his feet, his face a mask of purple bruises, holding a secondary piece. He was leaning against the foyer door, shaking but conscious. You're bleeding out for a cleaner. Look at you. The dragon is leaking. Jin-ho felt the strength leaving his legs. He slid down the wall, leaving a dark streak on the paint. He looked at the elevator. The light turned green. She was gone. She was safe. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He looked at Gwang, the suppressed Glock heavy in his hand. She wasn't just a cleaner, Jin-ho whispered, the world beginning to gray at the edges. She was the one who pulled me out of the fire when the noodle shop burned. She was the only one who didn't let me die then. Gwang raised his gun, his finger on the trigger. Then I'll send you back to the fire. The elevator doors at the end of the hall dinged. But it wasn't Mrs. Cho leaving. It was the penthouse security team, the real enforcers, led by Jin-ho's most loyal lieutenant. The room became a whirlwind of lead and screams. Gwang disappeared under a barrage of fire. Jin-ho felt hands on his shoulders, voices calling his name, the fake name, the title. He didn't answer. He watched the service elevator doors close one last time. In his pocket, his hand brushed against the wax paper of the rice cake. The hospital room was a sea of white. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the low hum of monitors. Jin-ho lay still, his side wrapped in heavy gauze. His lieutenant stood by the window, his arms crossed. We cleared them all out, boss. Gwang's whole crew. The council is terrified. They think you've become untouchable. Jin-ho didn't look at him. He was looking at the small wooden bedside table. There, sitting next to a glass of water, was a fresh rice cake. Did you find her? Jin-ho asked. The cleaner? She disappeared into the city. No records, no address. It's like she was never there. Jin-ho closed his eyes. He knew better. She was there. She was always there in the shadows of his conscience. He reached out and touched the rice cake. It was still warm. Boss, the lieutenant hesitated. The men are asking why you did it. Why you broke cover for her. They're worried it's a weakness. Jin-ho turned his head, his gaze sharp enough to draw blood. A man who forgets the person who fed him when he was starving isn't a leader. He's a dog. If they don't understand that, they can leave. The lieutenant bowed and left the room. Jin-ho was alone with the silence. He thought about the door. The heavy, mahogany door he had opened for her. It was the only thing he had done in 20 years that made him feel like Sangwoo again. He picked up the rice cake and took a bite. Tasted like home. It tasted like a life he could have had if the world hadn't been so cruel. He realized then that his empire wasn't his strength. It was his prison. And a small, frail woman with a mop bucket had been the only one with the key. If you believe that a single act of kindness can outweigh a lifetime of shadows, drop a like so the world remembers that even the coldest hearts have a beginning. He looked at the window. The sun was setting over Seoul, the glass towers glowing like embers. He knew the war wasn't over. The council would come for him. His rivals would see his mercy as a target. But for the first time he wasn't afraid. He reached into the drawer of the nightstand and pulled out a burner phone. He dialed a number he had memorized 20 years ago. It rang 3 times before a soft, weary voice answered. Hello. Jin-ho took a breath, the pain in his side a dull throb. The door is still open, Mrs. Cho. There was a long silence on the other end. Then a soft sob. Sangwoo? Is it really you? It's me, he whispered. And I'm coming home. He hung up the phone and pulled the 4-lead from his arm. The monitors began to wail, a shrill, frantic sound that echoed through the sterile halls. He didn't care. He stood up, clutching his side, and walked toward the door. He didn't need a suit. He didn't need a gun. He just needed to walk through it. He stepped into the hallway, the nurses and security guards freezing at the sight of him. He didn't look at them. He walked toward the exit, each step a struggle, each breath a victory. He reached the heavy glass doors of the hospital. He paused. A young orderly was struggling with a cart of linens, the wheels stuck in the door frame. Jin-ho reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gripped the handle. He pulled the door wide. "Go ahead," Jin-ho said. The orderly looked up, startled, then nodded and pushed the cart through. Jin-ho watched him go. He stepped out into the night air, the wind cold against his skin. He started walking. He didn't look back at the hospital. He didn't look back at the empire he was leaving behind. In the distance, the neon lights of the city flickered like stars. Somewhere in that maze of concrete and light, there was a noodle shop, or the memory of one. And there was a woman who was waiting for a boy named Sang-woo. The dragon was gone. The monster was dead. There was only a man walking through the night, toward a debt that was finally being paid. Not in blood. Not in gold. But in the simple, quiet act of opening a door. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about the hidden light in the darkest places. As he turned the corner into a dark alleyway, he saw a figure standing under a flickering street lamp. It was her. She was holding a small, tattered umbrella against the light drizzle. She looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. "Sang-woo," she breathed. He stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs. He smiled, a real, true smile that reached his eyes. "I'm here, mother." She walked toward him, her small feet splashing in the puddles. She wrapped her arms around him, her head resting against his chest. He held her tight, the scent of ginger and laundry soap filling his senses. The world around them vanished. There were no mobs, no councils, no guns. There was only this. He looked up at the sky, the rain washing away the dust of the penthouse. He was free. If this story broke your heart the way it broke mine, leave a like so I know to tell more stories like this. He walked her home, his hand in hers, through the streets of the city that no longer belonged to him. And for the first time in his life, Jin-ho, Sang-woo, knew exactly where he was going. He was going to a place where doors were never locked, and the only thing that mattered was the person on the other side. The penthouse was silent, but the air felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. Jin-ho stood in front of his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the city. For 20 years he had seen Seoul as a grid of profit and loss. Now all he could see were the alleyways where shadows hid the people like Mrs. Cho. His lieutenant, Kim, entered the room. He didn't speak. He simply laid a file on the desk. It was a surveillance report on the cleaning crew. "The council isn't just angry, boss," Kim said, his voice tight. "They're insulted. They sent a message through the back channels. They want Mrs. Cho's head on a plate to restore the balance. They say you've grown soft, that the dragon has lost his teeth." Jin-ho didn't turn around. He traced a crack in the glass with his finger, a souvenir from Gwang's bullet. "Soft? I saved a life that was worth more than the entire council combined. If they want teeth, I'll show them how I bite." "They've already moved," Kim whispered. "They've frozen the offshore accounts linked to the cleaning contracts. They're tracking her, Jin-ho. She's gone to ground, but they have the best bloodhounds in the country." Jin-ho felt a cold, familiar knot tighten in his stomach. He wasn't afraid for himself. He had lived with a target on his back since he was 16. But the thought of Mrs. Cho, the woman who had once bandaged his knees after he fell in the soot of the noodle shop, being hunted like an animal made his blood turn to ice. "Get the car," Jin-ho commanded. "And call the fixer. Tell him I need a ghost identity. Not for me. For a woman. Boss, if you do this, there's no coming back. You're declaring war on the very throne you sit on." Jin-ho turned, his eyes flashing with a lethal clarity. "Then let it burn. I'm tired of sitting on a throne made of ash." As they descended in the elevator, the lights flickered. The building's security had been compromised. The dragon's fortress was no longer safe. Jin-ho reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy silver-plated lighter, the only other thing he had saved from the fire years ago. He struck it, watching the flame dance in the reflection of the polished steel. The shantytown smelled of charcoal smoke and wet earth. Jin-ho's leather shoes, worth more than the entire block, crunched on the gravel. He found her in a tiny room behind a temple, illuminated by a single buzzing fluorescent light. She was sitting on a floor mat, her hands trembling as she tried to thread a needle. "Mrs. Cho," he said softly. She looked up, and for a second the fear in her eyes vanished, replaced by a heartbreaking warmth. Sangwoo, I knew you'd come. You always had a way of finding the light. You have to leave, Jin-ho said, kneeling beside her. They're coming. Not just for me but for anyone who knows who I was. I'm 80 years old, Sangwoo, she said, her voice a fragile rasp. I've spent my life running from fires. I'm tired. If the shadows want me, let them take me. Not on my watch, Jin-ho hissed. Outside, the sound of a heavy engine idling cut through the night. A black van pulled up to the temple gate. Men in tactical gear, their faces hidden by balaclavas, poured out like ink spilled on a page. They weren't thugs, they were the council's private cleaners. Jin-ho didn't have his guards. He didn't have his guns. He had a kitchen knife he had snatched from the temple's communal area and a heavy iron incense burner. Stay behind the altar, Jin-ho commanded. The first man burst through the door. Jin-ho didn't hesitate. He dived low, catching the man's knee with the incense burner, the heavy metal snapping bone. As the man fell, Jin-ho drove the knife into the gap in his tactical vest. It was brutal, efficient, and silent. But there were more. A hail of gunfire shredded the paper doors of the room. Jin-ho grabbed Mrs. Cho, shielding her body with his own as they rolled toward the back exit. A bullet grazed his shoulder, but he didn't feel the pain, only the desperate need to keep her breathing. Go to the river. Jin-ho shouted over the noise. The black sedan with the tinted windows. Don't look back. He stood in the doorway, a solitary figure against a dozen professional killers. He wasn't a boss anymore. He was a wall. He fought with a primal ferocity that shocked even the seasoned mercenaries. He took hits, he gave them back tenfold, his silk suit turning into a tattered, crimson rag. The Mapo Bridge loomed over the Han River like a giant spine. The rain was coming down in sheets now, washing the blood from Jin-ho's face as he leaned against the railing. He was alone. The men at the temple were either dead or incapacitated, but he knew more would be coming. A car pulled up, not the sedan but a sleek, silver coupe. The door opened and the chairman of the council stepped out, an umbrella held over his head by a silent assistant. You've cost us a lot of money tonight, Jin-ho, the chairman said, his voice as smooth as silk. All for a woman who will be dead in a few years anyway. Was it worth it? Jin-ho looked at the chairman, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive, the real reason he had opened the door to his vault. This drive contains every transaction, every bribe, every murder the council has authorized in the last decade, Jin-ho said, his voice a low vibration. I've already set it to upload to every major news outlet in the country. If I don't enter a code in the next 10 minutes, the Dragon's empire doesn't just fall, it gets incinerated. The chairman's face paled. You're bluffing. You'd go down with us. I'm already dead, Jin-ho smiled, a bloody, terrifying sight. I died in that noodle shop 20 years ago. Everything since then has just been a long, cold dream. Tonight I finally woke up. The chairman hesitated, the power shifting visibly in the rain-slicked darkness. He signaled his men to stand down. What do you want? A ghost identity for Mrs. Cho. A house in the countryside. And a promise that no one with the dragon's mark ever sets foot near her again. And you? Jin-ho looked out at the dark water. I'm going to find the boy I left in the fire. If you believe that a man's true character is revealed not by how he treats his equals, but by how he protects the most vulnerable, hit the like button so Jin-ho's sacrifice isn't forgotten by the algorithm. The district of Dongdaemun had moved on, but the corner of 4th and Market still smelled of wet soot whenever it rained. Jin-ho stood before the scorched skeleton of what was once Kim's Noodles. The iron shutters were rusted shut, weeping orange streaks onto the cracked pavement. He didn't look like a kingpin anymore. His designer coat was gone, replaced by a nondescript gray jacket that soaked up the drizzle. He pulled a heavy crowbar from a gym bag and forced the side door. The screech of metal against metal sounded like a dying animal. Inside, the air was stagnant, thick with the scent of 30-year-old ash and charred timber. He clicked on a flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, resting on a melted plastic stool, the very one he had sat on the night the stove exploded. I told you not to come back here, Sangwoo. Jin-ho didn't flinch. He turned the light slowly. Standing in the corner, leaning against a blackened pillar, was a man he hadn't seen in 2 decades. It was Han, the ghost of the market, the man who had taught a young orphan how to hide in the shadows before the Mafia taught him how to rule them. You're supposed to be in a villa in Jeju, Han, Jin-ho said, his voice flat. And you're supposed to be on a throne, Han replied, stepping into the light. He looked at the bandages peeking through Jin-ho's collar. You traded it all for a washerwoman. The council is calling it a psychotic break. I call it a late-onset conscience. The council is gone, Han. Or they will be by dawn, Jin-ho said, moving toward the back of the shop. He began to clear away charred floorboards. Underneath lay a heavy, fireproof safe, its surface bubbled by the heat of the past. I didn't come for the money. I came for the ledger I left behind before I became the dragon. The names of the boys who started the fire? Han asked. No, Jin-ho grunted as the safe door groaned open. The names of the men who paid them to do it. The men who are now the pillars of the city. Jin-ho pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. It wasn't an account of crimes but a map of the city's foundation, built on the blood of the poor. As he gripped the book, the sound of heavy tires crunched on the gravel outside. You weren't followed, Han whispered, reaching for a suppressed pistol. You were tracked. The dragon's mark is still on you, Sang-woo. It never leaves. The ruins of the noodle shop became a slaughterhouse. The first wave of enforcers didn't use guns. They used machetes and silence. They slipped through the broken windows like oil. Jin-ho moved with a frantic, desperate grace. He used the environment he knew by heart, the narrow corridors, the low-hanging pipes, the hidden crawlspaces. He cornered the first attacker near the old cold storage. Instead of a knife, Jin-ho used a heavy meat hook, swinging it with a strength born of pure adrenaline. The sound of meat meeting metal echoed through the hollow building. Sang-woo, to your left. Han roared. A flash of steel narrowly missed Jin-ho's throat. He spun, grabbing the attacker's wrist and snapping it against the edge of a stainless steel table. He was no longer a strategist. He was a cornered animal fighting for the right to exist. But the numbers were against them. A second wave burst through the front shutters, armed with submachine guns. The staccato rhythm of gunfire shredded the remaining wood of the shop. Jin-ho dived behind the heavy iron stove, the very object that had started his life of fire. Han, get out. Jin-ho shouted, return firing with a discarded weapon. I already died 20 years ago, kid. Han laughed, a grim, rattling sound, as he tossed a homemade incendiary device into the center of the room. The explosion turned the ruins into a furnace once again. In the chaos of the orange flames, Jin-ho saw his exit. He grabbed the leather notebook and dived through a hole in the floorboards that led to the old sewer lines. As he fell into the cold, black water below, he heard the shop collapse above him, burying the ghost and the hitmen in a tomb of ash. Jin-ho emerged from a manhole 3 blocks away, dripping with filth and blood. He walked through the neon streets of Seoul, a phantom that the Saturday night crowds didn't even notice. He reached the National Broadcasters building at 3 a.m. He didn't go to the front desk. He went to the rooftop helipad, where a young, ambitious journalist named Sora was waiting. She had received his message an hour ago. You're the dragon, she whispered, her camera crew shaking as they leveled their lenses at the bleeding man. I was, Jin-ho said, tossing the leather notebook at her feet. Now I'm just a witness. That book contains the names of the 5 men who currently run the Ministry of Justice and the National Police. They burned my home 30 years ago to clear the land for their skyscrapers. They've been burning homes ever since. Why give this to me? Sora asked, her voice trembling. They'll kill you before you leave this building. Jin-ho looked at the camera, his eyes burning with a light that hadn't been there in decades. He wasn't looking at the viewers. He was looking for a small, elderly woman in a safe house somewhere in the mountains. Because the only way to kill a dragon is to take away its hoard, Jin-ho said to the lens. I'm giving the city back to the people who actually live in it. He turned and walked to the edge of the roof. Below, the blue and red lights of 100 police cars began to swarm the building like hornets. If you believe that the truth is worth more than a kingdom, drop a like so the message of the dragon's fall reaches every corner of the world. The countryside of Gangwon-do was silent, save for the sound of a wood-burning stove. Mrs. Cho sat on a porch, a thick wool blanket over her knees. She was watching a news report on a small battery-powered TV. The headlines were a whirlwind: mass arrests in Seoul. Government collapse. The Dragon of Busan disappears. A shadow fell over her. She didn't look up, she knew the footsteps. The rice is almost ready, Sang-woo, she said softly. Jin-ho sat down on the wooden steps beside her. His arm was in a sling, and a fresh scar ran down the side of his jaw, but his eyes were clear. He looked at his hands, they were stained with soil from the garden he had spent the morning tending. Is it over? She asked. The dragon is dead, Halmione, he replied, leaning his head against the porch railing. The boy is just tired. She reached out and took his hand, her thumb tracing the calluses. There was no gold ring, no silver dragon, just the warm skin of a sun. In the distance, the sun began to rise over the mountains, bathing the valley in a soft, forgiving light. The war was over. The debt was paid. For the first time in 30 years, the boy who survived the fire was finally truly warm.